London, January 30th, 1661. A cold winter morning at Westminster Abbey. 3 coffins are quietly removed from their resting places in what should have been their final sanctuary. Within hours, the remains inside would undergo a posthumous punishment almost unthinkable in modern times, a final act in a political drama that had rocked England to its core. This is the bizarre, real-life story of Oliver Cromwell's head, and how it vanished, resurfaced, and travelled for nearly 300 years after his death. A journey so strange that if it weren't documented in historical records, you might think it was fiction. To understand why anyone would disturb a man's grave and publicly display his head, we must first understand who Oliver Cromwell was and why he inspired such passionate hatred and devotion. Born in 1599 to a family of minor gentry in Huntingdonshire, Cromwell spent the first 40 years of his life in relative obscurity. He was a country gentleman, a Puritan with strong religious convictions, and a member of Parliament. Nothing in his early years suggested he would become one of the most consequential and controversial figures in English history. That changed when tensions between Parliament and King Charles I erupted into civil war in 1642. Charles, believing in the divine right of kings, had repeatedly dissolved Parliament and ruled without it. Parliament, increasingly dominated by Puritans like Cromwell, resisted what they saw as royal tyranny and Catholic influence. Cromwell, though lacking formal military training, revealed an unexpected talent for warfare. He created the new model army, a disciplined professional fighting force driven by religious zeal and revolutionary purpose. This army would prove decisive in the conflict. After Parliament's victory in 1646, political instability continued. King Charles refused to accept meaningful limits on his power, even from prison. In 1649, after a second brief civil war, Cromwell supported the radical step of putting the king on trial for treason. The trial and execution of King Charles I on January 30th, 1649, shattered the concept of divine monarchy that had governed England for centuries. For the first time, a reigning monarch had been tried and executed by his subjects, a revolutionary act that shocked Europe. In the power vacuum that followed, Cromwell emerged as England's de facto ruler. After unsuccessful experiments with parliamentary governance, he was named Lord Protector in 1653, effectively England's first and only non-royal head of state until the 20th century. As Lord Protector, Cromwell pursued policies that reflected his Puritan beliefs. He banned gambling and bear-baiting, restricted theatre performances, and enforced strict religious observance. Christmas celebrations were curtailed as too pagan and Catholic. These moral reforms made him deeply unpopular with many ordinary people. His foreign policy was more successful. Under Cromwell, England's military and naval power expanded significantly, securing victories against the Dutch, Spanish, and various colonial rivals, laying groundwork for future British imperial power. In Ireland, Cromwell's legacy would be permanently stained by brutal military campaigns in 1649-1650 that resulted in the massacre of civilians at Drogheda and Wexford. To this day, his name remains synonymous with cruelty and oppression in Irish historical memory. Cromwell died of natural causes on September 3, 1658, at age 59, possibly from malaria or typhoid fever complicated by kidney stones. Despite declining an offer to become king in 1657, he had arranged for his son Richard to succeed him as Lord Protector, establishing a hereditary system in all but name. Richard Cromwell, lacking his father's authority and military backing, quickly lost power. By 1660, the exiled son of King Charles I would return to England as King Charles II, ending England's brief republican experiment. Cromwell's legacy was complicated. To religious dissenters and parliamentary reformers, he was a champion of liberty. To royalists and traditionalists, he was a fanatical dictator who murdered a divinely appointed king. This division helps explain why his posthumous treatment would be so extraordinary. For the returning royalists, Cromwell wasn't just a political opponent, he was the regicide who had killed their king's father, a crime they considered unforgivable, even beyond the grave. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this exploration of history's strangest posthumous journey, please take a moment to like and subscribe. We uncover forgotten historical tales every week, and your subscription helps us keep bringing these stories to light. Thank you to all who do. When Oliver Cromwell died on September 3, 1658, England lost its most powerful figure. Despite his controversial rule, his death was marked with elaborate ceremony befitting a head of state. His body was embalmed, the organs removed and the cavities filled with preservative spices and aromatics, before being wrapped in layers of perfumed cloth and placed in a lead-lined wooden coffin. For the funeral, Parliament allocated the staggering sum of £60,000, equivalent to millions in today's currency. Cromwell lay in state at Somerset House for several weeks, his effigy displayed on a bed of royal purple. On November 23rd, a funeral procession, including over 30,000 soldiers, accompanied his coffin to Westminster Abbey, where England's monarchs and greatest figures were traditionally interred. There, in the Henry VII Lady Chapel, Cromwell was laid to rest near the graves of medieval kings. By burying him in this sacred royal space, his supporters were making a statement. Though he had refused the crown, Cromwell deserved to rest among England's greatest rulers, but his rest would be brief. The Protectorate government collapsed within months of his death. By 1660, the son of the executed Charles I returned from exile in the restoration of the monarchy. Charles II, determined to secure his position, initially offered pardon to most who had opposed his father, but not to those directly responsible for the late king's execution. In an act of political theatre, Charles II ordered the posthumous trial of the regicides, those who had signed his father's death warrant. The living would face execution, the dead would not escape judgment either. On January 30th, 1661, the 12th anniversary of Charles I's execution, a macabre scene unfolded. The bodies of Cromwell, his son-in-law Henry Ireton, and John Bradshaw, who had presided over Charles I's trial, were exhumed from Westminster Abbey. The corpses, still remarkably preserved due to the embalming process, were transported to the Red Lion Inn in Holborn. The next morning, they were placed in open coffins upon hurdles, the wooden frames used to drag condemned prisoners to execution, and pulled through the streets to Tyburn, London's traditional execution site. At Tyburn, where thousands of criminals had met their end, the three corpses were symbolically executed. They were removed from their coffins and suspended from the gallows until evening. Then, in a final act of posthumous punishment, their heads were separated from their bodies and displayed on 20-foot poles above Westminster Hall, where Parliament met and where Charles I had been tried. This was calculated political symbolism. The public display served as a warning to anyone who might consider challenging royal authority again. Cromwell's headless body, along with those of Ireton and Bradshaw, was buried beneath the Tyburn gallows, a final indignity for a man who had once ruled England. But while his body remained there, largely forgotten, his head was about to begin a strange journey through English history. The head was fixed on a spike, secured in place by a wooden rod driven through the neck vertebrae. There it remained, exposed to the elements for over 2 decades, a grim reminder of royal vengeance visible to anyone passing near Parliament. But nature would eventually intervene where politics hadn't, beginning the next chapter in this macabre tale. For 24 years, Cromwell's head remained on its pike above Westminster Hall, weathering sun, rain, and snow. Birds perched on it, while insects nested in the dried skin and hollow eye sockets. The preserved flesh gradually darkened and contracted, pulling tightly over the skull in a grotesque transformation. Then, one night in the 1680s, likely during the Great Storm of 1703 according to some accounts, the wooden pole snapped in violent winds. After nearly a quarter century on display, Cromwell's head fell to the ground and disappeared into the darkness of history. Who found this gruesome relic? According to the most compelling accounts, a sentinel discovered the fallen head but, rather than alerting authorities, secreted it away to his private residence. Was he a hidden Cromwell sympathizer, or simply someone who recognized a valuable curiosity? We may never know his true motives, but this anonymous figure's decision launched the head on a remarkable path through private collections and public exhibitions. For decades, the head's whereabouts were unknown to the public. England moved on. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 established constitutional monarchy. The Stuart dynasty ended, replaced by Hanoverians. Through war, peace, and imperial expansion, Cromwell's skull passed quietly from hand to hand in the shadows of history. The curtain of secrecy lifted briefly in the 1710s when the head appeared in the private museum of Claudius Dupuy, a Swiss-French collector who displayed it alongside exotic oddities for paying visitors. What conversations must have occurred as curious Londoners gazed upon what might be the preserved face of the man who had once ruled England with an iron will? And more importantly, was this truly Cromwell, or merely a clever counterfeit designed to separate the curious from their coins? After Dupuy's death in 1738, the trail goes cold again until the 1780s, when the head appeared in the possession of the Russell family. They claim to have purchased it from the museum of one Samuel Russell, no relation, an actor and comedian who had supposedly acquired it from Dupuy's estate. During this period, the head's authenticity became a subject of increasing interest. As the Enlightenment fostered scientific curiosity, various medical men and antiquarians examined the relic. The evidence for its authenticity was compelling. The head showed signs of professional embalming, had a distinctive wart that matched contemporary portraits of Cromwell, and retained a section of the wooden spike used to mount it at Westminster. Yet doubts remained. Could this really be the preserved head of England's only non-royal head of state? Or was it a clever forgery? Without modern forensic techniques, certainty remained elusive. By the end of the 18th century, the head had become something of an embarrassment to its owners. Revolutionary movements in America and France had renewed interest in republicanism and made Cromwell a more sympathetic figure to some. Displaying his preserved head seemed increasingly distasteful. The head disappeared from public view again, entering another shadowy period in its journey. Rumors persisted that it passed through the hands of various collectors, was briefly displayed in a traveling show, or was even used in secretive political or occult rituals. What is certain is that it continued to exist, preserved by the same embalming techniques that had prepared it for state funeral over a century earlier. As the 19th century dawned, bringing Victorian fascination with death and historical relics, Cromwell's head would emerge once more into the light, beginning the most well-documented chapter of its strange afterlife. In 1812, the head surfaced again in the possession of the daughter of one Samuel Russell, who claimed her family had kept it for 3 generations. Financial difficulties forced her to sell the relic to 3 men who recognized its potential commercial value. These entrepreneurs, Josiah Henry Wilkinson, James Cox, and a man named Robbins, intended to exhibit the head publicly. They commissioned a thorough examination by scientists and historians to verify its authenticity. The experts noted several compelling details. The embalming method matched 17th century techniques. The remaining hair contained traces of spices used in Cromwell's known embalming, and the spike fragment matched those used at Westminster Hall. For a brief period, the head was displayed in London, where the public could view it for a small fee. The exhibition provoked mixed reactions. Some visitors were fascinated by this tangible connection to a pivotal moment in English history, and others found it distasteful. The controversy made the exhibition financially unsuccessful, and the partners dissolved their arrangement. Wilkinson bought out his associates and took sole possession of the head, which would remain in his family for the next century. The Wilkinson family treated the relic with reverence. Rather than displaying it publicly, they kept it in a velvet-lined box, showing it only to select visitors, historians, artists, and medical men who might contribute to understanding its provenance. The head became a private historical artifact, rather than a public spectacle. During this period, it featured in scholarly articles and historical debates. Drawings and descriptions appeared in academic journals. The writer Thomas Carlyle, working on his monumental history of the English Civil War, examined it and was convinced of its authenticity. He described it as a sad, stern memorial of dark things. The Victorian fascination with phrenology, the pseudo-scientific study of skull shapes to determine character, brought renewed interest. Phrenologists examined Cromwell's skull, claiming it showed the bumps and contours indicating exceptional leadership abilities and strong moral character. These examinations, while scientifically invalid by modern standards, created detailed records of the head's physical characteristics that would later prove valuable for authentication. By the early 20th century, the head resided with Canon Horace Wilkinson, the last private owner. He kept it in a wooden box in his study at Woodbridge School in Suffolk, where he taught. Occasionally, he would show it to students as an educational tool, a practice that would be unthinkable today. By now, the head had developed a particular mystique. Writers, poets, and playwrights referenced it in their work. Political cartoonists used it as a symbol. Some spiritualists claimed to have communicated with Cromwell's ghost, who supposedly expressed displeasure at his head's continued separation from his body. World War I and its aftermath brought changing attitudes toward death and human remains. The massive casualties and shifting cultural values made the display of historic human remains increasingly problematic. Canon Wilkinson began to consider a more dignified final disposition for the head that had passed through so many hands over more than 2 centuries. As medical science advanced, new examinations provided stronger evidence of authenticity. The 1930s analysis confirmed the preservation methods were consistent with those used for high state funerals in the 17th century. The severing showed signs of having been done posthumously rather than as a cause of death. The remaining hair, skin, and bone structure matched contemporary portraits and descriptions of Cromwell. By the 1950s, the elderly Canon Wilkinson was ready to part with his unusual inheritance. But rather than selling it or donating it to a museum where it might still be displayed, he began discreet conversations about a proper burial. The head's journey was about to enter its final chapter, one marked by dignity rather than spectacle. On March 25, 1960, a small group gathered for a simple ceremony at Sidney Sussex College, Cambridge. Oliver Cromwell had studied there as a young man in 1616, before anyone could have imagined his historical significance. Now, 344 years later, what was almost certainly his head had returned to complete a circle. The ceremony was deliberately private. No press attended, no photographs were taken, only a handful of witnesses were present: college officials, a representative of the Wilkinson family, and reportedly a descendant of Cromwell himself. Canon Horace Wilkinson had arranged for the head to be buried within the college grounds, feeling that a university setting was most appropriate for a man who, despite his controversial legacy, valued education. The head was placed in a small oak box, which was then sealed within a larger container. A simple interment followed, with appropriate religious rites. A quiet dignity finally afforded to remains that had been subjected to public display for centuries. The exact location within the college was kept secret to prevent the site from becoming either a shrine for admirers or a target for those who still viewed Cromwell as a villain. The college kept no marker or monument that might draw attention to the burial location. Even today, while the college acknowledges that Cromwell's head is buried somewhere on the grounds, the precise spot remains undisclosed. This secrecy was not merely academic caution. Even in the mid-20th century, Cromwell remained a polarizing figure. In England, opinions about his legacy still divided along religious and political lines. In Ireland, his name continued to evoke bitter memories of brutality and oppression. College authorities feared that a known grave might attract vandalism or demonstrations. The quiet burial revealed how much attitudes toward death and human remains had changed. What once was displayed as a political trophy and later as a curiosity had become something deserving of privacy and respect. The journey from pike to burial reflected broader shifts in how society views the proper treatment of the dead, regardless of their historical significance. As for the rest of Cromwell's remains, their fate remains uncertain. His headless body was likely buried beneath the Tyburn gallows after the posthumous execution in 1661. Urban development has long since covered the site, now located near Marble Arch in central London. During 19th century construction in the area, workers uncovered numerous skeletal remains, but none could be definitively identified as Cromwell's. Some historians speculate that Cromwell's supporters might have secretly recovered his body shortly after its burial at Tyburn, reinterring it in an unmarked grave to prevent further desecration. Others suggest it remained at Tyburn, now lost beneath London's streets. The mystery of his body's location endures, creating the strange circumstance that we know more about what happened to his head than to the rest of his remains. The final burial at Cambridge closed a circle that spanned centuries of English history. A man who helped end divine right monarchy, who refused a crown while wielding king-like power, whose body was treated as a political prop, finally received the dignified treatment any human remains deserve. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this story is that it happened at all, that a head could be displayed, fall, be collected, preserved, studied, debated, and finally buried, all while maintaining its identity and provoking continued fascination across centuries. Few historical artifacts have traveled such a winding path through private hands while remaining intact and identifiable. Today, Oliver Cromwell remains as divisive as ever, but the journey of his head, from public punishment to quiet burial, reminds us that how we treat the dead reflects who we are as much as who they were. The story isn't just about Cromwell, it's about how societies process controversial figures in death as well as life. Do you think Cromwell deserved what happened to him, even in death? Let me know in the comments below.